Hello, my name is Dr. Censu Caruana from the University of Malta, and in this webinar, we will learn how to infuse sustainability across our research with a special focus on transformational leadership in agroecology, bridging divides through transdisciplinarity. And here I would also like to start by thanking the Cost Action, Shift, Social Sciences and Humanities for Transformation and Climate Resilience. This webinar is done within the framework of this Shift Cost Action. I also gave this lecture at the University of Catania on the 17th June with our doctoral students, where we learned how to infuse sustainability across research. So something about where I am coming from. So I form part of the Center for Environmental Education and Research. It is a center at the University of Malta. We promote education for sustainable development and related research in the Euromed region by seeking to catalyze change towards a sustainable society. We have 3 programs: a Master's in Education for Sustainable Development for those who would like to specialize in sustainability education. We have a certificate course in environmental education and interpretation, and we also have a doctoral program. So what do we understand by sustainable development? I decided to start with this slide purposefully because sometimes we tend to confuse sustainable development with nature. So by putting in this picture, I am trying to break this mental construct where we tend to associate sustainable development with nature. Of course, nature and the protection, the conservation, the restoration, the regeneration of nature is a very important part of sustainable development, as we shall see. But I would like you to stop a moment to look at this slide. It shows activism, it shows the need to be heard. This ends now is basically showing that there's something wrong with where we are now. There's also this idea of justice, of social justice. So I will give a quick overview of the main milestones in sustainable development, in sustainability. The first signs that things were not well was the publication of Silent Spring, the famous book by Rachel Carson in 1962. This book documented the detrimental effects of the indiscriminate use of synthetic pesticides on human health and the environment. It actually has been named as one of the 25 greatest science books of all times. Then in 1972, Donella Meadows and others, through the Club of Rome, published the book The Limits to Growth. This book was extremely important because it alerted us to the fact that our model of development cannot assume infinite growth. It discussed exponential economic and population growth within a finite supply of resources through a computer simulation. And this book really helped us question whether the model of the American dream, infinite consumption, is actually possible within the confines of one world. Later, we had the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, which took place in Stockholm in 1972. This explored the hard question that we are still discussing till today. It explored how concerns about development and concerns about the environment can be compatible. The mainstream thinking, the dominant paradigm, puts nature and economics as against each other, and in practice, economics takes the upper hand. So what was the backdrop to the conference? It's what I have outlined, that the dominant thinking was that concerns about development and the environment are incompatible, but also the question of our responsibility, our role regarding the environment, the understanding that it's not just about economics, it's just not about economic growth, but that we have a role and responsibility for the environment. Perhaps today, although we still often act as if we don't have a responsibility for the environment, but it sounds so strange to actually consider this as a breakthrough, this idea that we do have a responsibility for the environment, and that environmental protection, environmental problems transcend national frontiers. So this environmental damage that needs to be stopped can only happen through international cooperation and collaboration. So the conference at that time was characterized by a conflict of interest between the wealthy and poor nations. This is to a certain extent logical, because poor nations could see how wealthy nations developed at the expense of the environment, and now they were sort of being asked not to copy the same model that had brought certain wealth to certain nations. Underdevelopment was actually, economic underdevelopment was actually identified as a root of environmental degradation. So you can understand this conflict, because at one point we are saying that underdevelopment is at the root of environmental degradation. And if you would like to develop, how can this be done in a way that does not impact the environment, while at the same time, wealthy nations had developed through a model that was based on consumption? There was already at that time an acknowledgement that any attempt to improve the quality of the environment had to be coupled with an equal effort to better the quality of life. This was really important, because one couldn't put the onus on poor nations to say, no, now you need to protect the environment. But the focus had to be at least equally on improving the quality of life. In 1987, the publication of Our Common Future, under the auspices of the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development, 1987. This is commonly known as the Brundtland Report. Brundtland was the surname of the Norwegian Prime Minister. Why is this so important? Well, it was intended as a progress report on the Stockholm Conference. It reviewed the critical environmental conditions of our planet and concluded that economic growth cannot be arrested. It somehow seemed something that is just happening, but that it needed to be approached differently. I personally have my questions on this, but I am reporting on the main thrust of the Brundtland report, the idea that economic growth cannot be arrested, and I'm saying that I have my own misgivings on this because later on you had movements like the growth movement, for example, that challenged this notion. But in any case, this Brundtland report was super important because of the definition of the term sustainable development. This is considered actually as the main contribution of the Brundtland report. In fact, it defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is still today the most quoted definition on sustainable development. You can understand that there was a bit of a uncomfortable backdrop. The idea, the notion, the recognition, the ever-increasing understanding of the reality that the Earth's resources are limited. So this concept was coined explicitly to suggest that it was possible to achieve economic growth and industrialization without environmental damage. So basically, there are these three ideas. The idea that it is possible to alter these growth trends and to establish a condition of ecological and economic stability that is sustainable far into the future. So if you understand well the definition of the Brundtland report, it was this time definition which sort of complemented the spatial definition of a good quality of life for all. But this time dimension, that sustainability is about establishing today the conditions of ecological and economic sustainability that are sustainable far into the future. That's why it referred to future generations. And this would mean that the basic material needs of each person on Earth are satisfied, the spatial dimension, each person on Earth, and each person has an equal opportunity to realize his or her individual human potential. And there was also this question of urgency. The sooner the world's poor decide to begin working to attain this target, the world's people decide, rather than the poor, the world's people decide to work on eradicating poverty, the greater will be their chances of success. And this is a simplification by Birch, 2012, who considered sufficiency. So in the previous slide, we saw the question of urgency. Here we are seeing the question of sufficiency. Enough. So basically, what do we mean by needs? A big question we are still grappling with today. What are needs? What is luxury? For everyone, the spatial dimension, forever, the time dimension. So I refer you back to the previous slide where the question of the sooner the world's people decide to begin working to attain this target, the greater will be their chances of success. So think of the urgency. That was 1987. And still we are where we are today. So this idea of sustainable development led to different graphical representations. This one is one of the popular ones, seeing the economy as a subset of society and society as a subset of the environment. Why is the economy a subset of society? Because there are many other things in a society which don't have an economic value but are very important. Culture, rituals, celebrations, relationships, cohesion. And of course, humans, societies, are just part of this one world. As the indigenous people would say, we are merely strands in the web of life. This was another model where three pillars, the environmental pillar, the societal pillar, and the economic pillar, intersect in the middle. And as you can see, they do intersect at one point. Only two of them. So where the environment and society intersect, we can imagine a livable world, livable cities and communities, but not necessarily thriving, because there is no intersection there of the economic pillar. The question where the economy and society intersect, so we can talk about a fair world because the wealth is being distributed in a just way, there is social inclusion, but that could be happening at the expense of the environment because there is no intersection with the circle environment. If we look at the intersection between the environment and the economy, it's a viable world. You have business practices with a low environmental impact, but it's just minimalist. It's viable. But what about the distribution? What about businesses and the community? So basically, it is only at the center where you have the three pillars intersecting. That is where we have sustainable development that is about a good quality of life for all. So, in truth, the theory says that they are equal circles. The reality is that economics usually takes precedence over society, and economics usually takes precedence over the environmental pillar. So we are talking about expanding. The change needed is expanding the importance we give to the environment so that the circles look more equal. That is the change needed in this graphical representation. This is a third way of doing it. The advantage of this graphical representation is that the pillars are actually drawn as pillars rather than as sets. And the pillars allow for more pillars to be added, while the circles and intersection can become quite messy the more you start adding circles and the more you start looking for the points of intersection. While this one allows you to add as many pillars as you would like. So eventually, there was the suggestion to the Executive Bureau of the United Cities and Local Governments in 2010 to add culture. This happened because the three-pillar model seemed to be a bit up there, a bit top-down, a bit United Nations speak. But how can it be translated to the local? How can it be translated to the street level, to the municipality level, to the community level, where culture gives so much meaning to the life of people? So today, actually, we talk much more about the four pillars of sustainable development rather than the three pillars. And of course, we can make space for others. So you have research which suggests spirituality as a possible pillar. And we all know the importance of religious communities as part of the social fabric of societies, and how spirituality and the expression of spirituality is in many communities a very important part of the rituals, of the calendars, of the milestones within every year. And then the question of governance, because at the end, can you have sustainable development if you have corruption, if there's no transparency, if there's no accountability? So, to a certain extent, the four-pillar model is now widely accepted, but there is space for reflection on further pillars. The publication of Caring for the Earth in 1991, jointly by the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, and WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. This is based on lessons learned about the complexity of the problems, but perhaps even more the need for radical and far-reaching actions to meet them. This is a strategy. This is a sort of blueprint. It shows the path we need to take based on 9 principles. So the first principle is respect and care for the community of life. It is very interesting here that it's normative, it's value-based. It's based on the value of respect, it's based for the value of care, and the web of life is seen as a community. And when you have a community, it means you have interrelationships, it means you have interactions. And then the other 4 principles really show the way on what needs to be done. We need to improve the quality of life for all. We need to conserve the Earth's vitality and diversity. This recognition of the living Earth, Gaia, its diversity that needs to be protected. We need to minimize the depletion of non-renewable resources, so this links back to the limits to growth. The non-renewable resources are not finite, so we need to minimize their depletion. And if we remember the first model I showed you on sustainable development, where the economy is a subset of society, which is a subset of the environment, it's exactly this. Keeping within the Earth's carrying capacity. How can this be done? We need a focus on 4 levels. The first level is me, changing personal attitudes and practices. The second level is the community level, enabling communities to care for their own environments. The third level is the national level, where every nation, every state needs to provide a framework, a national framework for integrating development and conservation. And finally, the need to create a global alliance. Again, we refer back to the 70s, where there was this growing understanding that environmental degradation has no frontiers, so the only way to go about protecting, conserving, and later on we started talking about restoring, regenerating the environment is through international collaboration. The need to create a global alliance. Here, to conclude this part, which attempted to give you a good grounding on understanding sustainability, because if we want to infuse sustainability across all research, which is basically what I am suggesting, we need to understand the basic principles. So these are the 4 pillars. Here we arrange them actually within the set theory. So the economic pillar, which is about viability, viable economic systems, fair distribution of resources. The social pillar, social equity, so equity, human rights, social justice, quality of life. The environmental pillar, so protecting natural resources, biodiversity, and the environment. And the cultural pillar, which is actually about cultural vitality, recognizing and valuing diverse cultures, heritages, and knowledge systems, the respect of different knowledge systems. 1992, the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit as it is often known. World leaders convened to discuss and map out a way forward in achieving this elusive balance between economic development, environmental protection, and social needs worldwide. Remember that this was 8 years before the change of the millennium, which in politics is not so much. So there was this idea of chartering the priorities for the next millennium, if you want. So the main thrust of the Rio Declaration was 27 principles, which we will not go over one by one because it's not possible in the limited time of this webinar, but it was about building and consolidating links between environment and development, reducing and eliminating unsustainable lifestyles. So here I would like to point that it is also about a lifestyle, the way of living we got used to. It's about participation, so actively involving citizens in the resolution of environmental issues. And from here onwards, the idea of participation became more institutionalized in a good way, it became more expected. The idea of accepting personal responsibility for actions that may threaten the quality of life and the quality of the environment. It's about me. The idea, again, of developing a global partnership to achieve sustainable development and ensure a better future for all. So you can see how these 9 principles that we referred to in the caring for the Earth strategy found their way here. So I said it was 8 years before the millennium. So basically, the Earth Summit published the agenda for the new millennium, the Agenda 21, the agenda for the 21st century. It was a non-binding, if you want, because there was no way to enforce this agenda. Voluntarily implemented action agenda to achieve global sustainable development by the start of the 21st century. And one major objective was that every local government draws its own local Agenda 21, Chapter 28. So here we can see that even the idea of culture, where the local became important, found its way here. Of course, local Agenda 21 was not only about culture, but it was about the idea that the lofty principles of Agenda 21 need to be translated at the local level. So actually, there was an invitation for each and every municipality to draw its own local Agenda 21 based on the 4 pillars of sustainability. Then the famous Millennium Summit, which was actually at the turn of the millennium in New York in the year 2000, which established the Millennium Development Goals. So 8 goals that were supposedly to be attained by 2015. And here the focus was much more on the world's poor nations. So these Millennium Development Goals focused on eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowering women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health. At that time, as you can understand, HIV/AIDS was very high up on the agenda. So the idea of the goal of combating HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, the goal of ensuring environmental sustainability, and the idea of the global partnership that is necessary for development. But I repeat that the focus here was much more about aid flows between economically developed countries and economically developing countries. So this recognition that health and well-being increased in many countries, but progress was limited and uneven across countries. So to a certain extent, the Millennium Summit tried to create these goals to respond to this gap, this understanding that progress was uneven across countries. And then you had 1992, so then in 20 years' time, the Rio Plus 20, 2012, there was again a reconvening, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, and the outcome document was the future we want. And this, to a certain extent, as you can understand, 2012 is 3 years before the expiration, when the Millennium Development Goals expire. So this document launched the process leading to the development of a set of new goals, which built upon the Millennium Development Goals, and they were called Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So the future we want proposed clear and practical actions for implementing sustainable development. I just give a couple of examples, proposing the green economy as a tool to achieve sustainable development. This is quite a breakthrough, starting to talk not about the economy, but about the green economy. Strengthening the United Nations Environmental Programme, promoting corporate sustainability reporting measures. So here, you can see this move towards more responsibility coming from the business world, if you want. The idea of promoting corporate sustainability reporting measures. So you become accountable by reporting. The idea of moving beyond the gross domestic product to assess a country's well-being, the understanding that the GDP is not good enough and we need other measurements, the understanding that sustainable development needs financing, it won't happen on its own, and the need to adopt a framework for tackling sustainable consumption and production. So here, the focus on the means of production and consumption. And here comes the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit 2015 in New York. This actually adopted the Transforming Our World, what we often call the Agenda 2030, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that actually included these Sustainable Development Goals. The MDGs were 8, the SDGs are 17, and associated with these 17 SDGs, we have 169 targets and 232 indicators. Some people have attempted to organize these 17 goals under the 5 Ps. So, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. So, people would be those goals linked to ending poverty and hunger in all forms and ensuring dignity and equality. Prosperity, those that ensure prosperity and fulfilling lives in harmony with nature. Planet, protecting our planet's natural resources and climate for future generations. So here we will understand that climate change became top of the agenda, and actually it has a goal on its own. So this is also very relevant for the shift cost action, and it is within this context that I am holding this webinar, because this Sustainable Development Challenge, to a certain extent, found its expression very strongly through the climate change challenge. The idea of partnership, so we can only implement the agenda through a solid global partnership. The idea of governance, if you want, which we saw was also one of the pillars suggested when research started suggesting new pillars beyond the 3 or 4 pillar model. We need to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And I put your focus again on the planet, because here we have climate for future generations, and we can understand here also the importance of youth who have a long future, and the big questions of what is the world in which our youth will grow up in. So you might be familiar with these icons. So here I have regrouped the same sustainable development goals under the 5 Ps here with the icons that now became so popular. So people, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality. Planet, the environmental SDGs, clean water and sanitation, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land. And within this shift cost action, we understand that the climate action and the creativity, the use of arts, the use of climate communication is so important, because it's not enough to have sustainable development, but we actually need to communicate sustainability. We need to create an emotional attachment in our communication so that people understand the urgency, understand their personal responsibility. So this is about climate action. And because my main thrust in this webinar is to show you that you can infuse sustainability across your research. So this is automatically transdisciplinary because my proposal is that we can actually infuse sustainable development goals, the link with one of the 17 goals, in whatever research you are doing. So prosperity, goals 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities. Peace, goal 16, peace, justice and strong institutions, partnership, goal 17. And here they are neatly organized with a link, which you can take a screenshot, and later on I will be inviting you to stop a bit if you are a researcher, if you are doing your doctorate, if you are doing your postdoc, if you are working in a think tank, if you are working at university where you do research regularly, to look at your research objectives, to try and see with which of these SDGs do your research objectives align. Now, this shift cost action actually is an invite to action. So now that I have explained what is sustainable development, I have invited you to consider how you can link your research to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The second part of this webinar will focus much more on we as individuals and societies need to learn to live together sustainably. We need to take action responsibly. So it is about how to develop sustainability responsibility, how to develop environmental responsibility. And I am an educator. My specialization is education for sustainable development. So people like me, we have a role in empowering people to change the way they think and work towards a sustainable future. And here under the shift cost action, we are really trying to create initiatives, actions, trainings that empower people to change the way we think. It is about challenging our mindset and work, so action, towards a sustainable future. SDG 4.7. So SDG 4 was about quality education. 4.7, the target says that we need to ensure that by 2030, all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, amongst others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. I will keep the slide a bit because it is very laden, every word is well thought out. But basically we are challenging the whole education system. This is a tall order that we as educators, as activists, we need to rise up to. Because basically we are saying that this is a goal in itself. It's a target, one of the 169 targets. We need to attain target 4.7. But we are also saying that all of the other targets, 168, cannot be attained without education for sustainable development. Because all learners need to acquire the knowledge and skills. So it is about going beyond knowledge. It's about skills so that we can contribute to sustainable development. So, a key strategy to achieve the target by 2030 is the mainstreaming of education for sustainable development and global citizenship in national curricula. So, I invite you who are watching this webinar to examine a bit the curricula of your own country and the extent to which sustainability and sustainable development and global citizenship education has been infused in your national curricula. Currently, countries address the principles of education for sustainable development and global citizenship education in a variety of ways. Among them are extracurricular activities, so community events, specific subjects, art, science, and also cross-curricular and whole school approaches. And the whole school approach today is taking a lot of traction because we look at the school as an institution where all of the parts, the administrative parts, the leadership parts, the governance parts, the curriculum parts, the community aspects and the links of the schools with the community, all of them are creating the necessary internal changes to point towards the same direction, sustainability. So let's focus on the definition. Education for sustainable development empowers learners to take informed decisions and responsible actions for environmental integrity, economic viability, and a just society for present and future generations while respecting cultural diversity. So you can see the 4 pillars here: environmental, economic, society, and culture. You can see the idea of empowerment, the idea that it's not about knowledge, but about using the knowledge. So informed decisions, using the knowledge to take decisions, and not only decisions, but using the knowledge to take responsible actions. It's not a one-off intervention, but it is a lifelong learning process, and it is an integral part of SDG4 quality education. It is a holistic and transformational education. So it forms part of the studies within the framework of transformative education, and it addresses learning content and outcomes, pedagogy, and the learning environment. So it's not just about the content, it's about the learning outcomes, in particular outcomes that are conducive to the responsible actions. It's about the pedagogy, whether it is participative or not. It's about the learning environment that we create, whether it is collaborative, what are the links with society, with communities, and so on. It achieves its purpose by transforming society. And higher education institutions and universities are key actors in the promotion of education for sustainable development. In fact, it is important for higher education institutions, universities, to also examine their curricula, examine their study units, examine to what extent these study units and how these study units link with the sustainable development goals. So it's about providing opportunities for students to develop the notion of global citizenship, a commitment towards environmental stewardship, opportunities to reflect about the interaction between issues of social justice, ethics, well-being, and ecological and economic factors. And again, the action part, a commitment towards actively ensuring sustainable futures. And this should be part of the training of students, part of their specialization, and part of their personal and professional development. It's the opportunity which higher education institutions give students to a change in the type of education that we offer, an education that infuses sustainability across the training, specialization, personal and professional development. So, between 2005 and 2014, the United Nations dedicated a decade on education for sustainable development. So this was roughly during the period of the Millennium Development Goals, during the latter period of the Millennium Development Goals. And when the decade expired, a certain momentum had been built. So UNESCO didn't want that this momentum that was built during the decade stops. So in 2014, the Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development was created. And this has been confirmed later on even in Aisha in Japan. So these 5 priority action areas are still the 5 priority action areas that are current. One of them is advancing policy. So the idea to mainstream education for sustainable development at national policy level. The other one is to transform learning environments, and here the whole institution approach, which in schools becomes the whole school approach, but it is something for institutions, whether it's higher education institutions like universities or even businesses, organizations, NGOs, corporations, and so on. But this cannot be done if we do not build the capacities of educators through training educators in ESD methodologies. A focus on youth, and this becomes particularly important when we look at SDG 13 on climate action, because youth feel the urgency of climate change even more. Youth suffer from eco-anxiety even more because they have a long future in front of them and they question the future that they have. So the idea of engaging young people as change agents and mobilizing youth. And then the 5th priority area is perhaps very intuitive. It's about urgency. It's about accelerating sustainable solutions. So to do this, we need to promote ESD at all levels and at all and in all areas. And how can this be done? This can be done by what we call the acquisition of key competencies in sustainability. So, what are competencies in sustainability? If we want to train teachers, if we want to build the capacity of educators, if we want to build the capacity of youth to engage in community action, this is about acquiring competencies in sustainability. These are the complexes of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that enable the successful task performance and problem solving related to real-world sustainability problems, challenges, and opportunities. So in this 3rd part of this webinar, I will be focusing on the acquisition of these competencies. And I would like to refer you back to the Global Action Program, that if we want to engage and mobilize youth, if we want to transform the learning environment, if we want to engage with policymakers, we need to acquire these new sustainability competencies. And UNESCO has done an analysis of different literature, and basically we can summarize these competencies as 8 competencies. And in the slide after this one, I will be explaining these competencies one by one. But with this current slide, I just want to point out that it is much more than knowledge. So knowledge transfer is not enough for competencies for sustainability. On your left, I put some keywords that one can associate with such competencies, such as critical thinking, problem solving, managing information, creativity and innovation, communication, collaboration, cultural and global citizenship, personal growth, and well-being. These are skills, abilities, and attitudes needed to address complex sustainability challenges. We understand today that sustainability challenges are complex, and that is why we need to acquire these new competencies. Here, I refer you back to a very important report, the Delors report, which was under the auspices of the United Nations also. And although it looks a bit as an old report because it is 1996, it does provide a framework for education built on 4 key pillars. And these 4 key pillars are still valid and foundational for developing sustainability competencies. So if we look on the left, it's about learning to know, learning to live together, learning to do, and learning to be. So I will explain a bit. The idea of learning to know, of course, gives importance to knowledge and awareness, but the idea of learning to live together is about the collaboration needed to solve environmental challenges. And the last 2 pillars, one of them is about me, learning to be. It's about my personal development. And the other one is about learning to do. It's about the action part. It's about the professional development part, where through my profession, I learn to do. So, the 8 key competencies in sustainability. The first one is systems thinking, understanding complex systems and interconnections. Unfortunately, many of us grew up in education systems which are very compartmentalized. Those of us that are working at university and watching this webinar might also understand that even within universities, there is often little collaboration between different faculties. Here, when we talk about this new competence that we need to acquire, the competency of systems thinking, it is about finding again the links between different subject matters, between different departments, between different faculties, and working more together. It is about re-questioning a compartmentalized education system and thinking of interconnections. It is about challenging the linear model of traditional thinking and learning and going towards models that are more complex, as you could see in the diagram that I put for you on the left-hand side of the slide. The second competency is the anticipatory competency, sometimes also called the futures competency, the ability to envision the future I want, the ability to put forward different possible scenarios, choosing which among those possible scenarios is my preferable one, and being able to design a plan to lead me towards the preferable future. Because most probably, in a business as usual scenario, out of the possible futures, the one which is the most probable might not be the one which is the most preferable. Competency number 3 is the normative competency, the one that we often link with values, the ethical considerations linked to sustainable development. When I was explaining sustainable development, we mentioned a number of principles like social justice, equity, that are very much linked to this normative competency. But this normative competency invites us to reflect on personal values and beliefs. It invites us to identify our core values, to understand perhaps how my upbringing, how my experiences influence my current core values, how I can actually challenge my own assumptions, the assumptions that perhaps are the result of my upbringing and experiences, the ability to consciously, purposefully seek diverse perspectives. And then again, it's like a cycle where I again look at my core values. This is a very important part of personal and professional development. The competency number 4 is the strategic competency. This one invites us to develop and implement sustainable strategies. It's not enough to be able to envision future scenarios. We need to be strategic and develop and implement strategies that lead us towards that preferable future. And this is something that certain research is pointing out that we need to focus more on strengthening this competency. The fifth competency is the collaboration competency. The idea that working in groups, working as communities is more effective in attaining sustainability goals. And this is actually at all levels. It could be at the level of an association, it could be at the level of a community, but also, as we have seen when we explained the Caring for the Earth strategy, the need to create global alliances. And this can only be done through acquiring and through strengthening our critical thinking, which is the sixth sustainability competency. The idea that I am able to analyze information, I am able to challenge assumptions, I am able to think out of the box, I am able to look for and co-create with others, co-design with others innovative solutions. The seventh key competency is about self-awareness. It's about how I position myself. It's about a reflection on my own role, on where I can bring the most impact. So in my case, I am an educator. And after many years of reflection, I understand that my role is to try and bring about change through my education endeavors. So this is a very important competency, this self-awareness competency, because it also invites us to leave a bit our head and look a bit more at the emotional awareness, the self-confidence, the accurate self-assessment. And the eighth and final competency that I would like to outline is what some people call the mega competency or the meta competency of problem solving, applying different problem solving frameworks to complex sustainability issues. Many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. I am here putting it in front of you because this really links closely both with the critical thinking competency as well as with the meta competency that, if you want, absorbs the previous 7 competencies in this mega competency of problem solving, because we need to go beyond the lower level skills of remembering and understanding towards the higher level skills of applying, of using information in new situations, of analyzing, drawing connections amongst ideas, of evaluating, justifying a stand or a decision, of creating, of innovation, of producing new or original work, of producing and creating new solutions to the sustainability challenges that we face. And this falls squarely under the shift cost action, because at the end the shift cost action is also very much at this apex of Bloom's taxonomy. And together we are trying to reflect how to design, assemble, construct, conjecture, develop, formulate, author, investigate new solutions to the climate change challenge. So the Arizona State University has actually produced this graphical representation of how systems thinking competency, future thinking competency, values thinking competency, and strategic thinking competency through the collaborative competency lead to the meta competence of meaningfully solving sustainability problems and fostering sustainable development. So here I invite you to pause a bit this webinar. I would like you to think about specific examples of projects, ecological projects. I am focusing in particular on agroecology in my current research, but it could be any other project that is somehow linked to the challenges that our shift cost action is inviting us to reflect on, and try and link these initiatives with the 8 competencies that I have just outlined. So, this is time to reflect as part of this webinar. I have invited you to do 2 things. I have invited you to look at your research, if you are conducting research, to see how you can integrate the 4 pillars of sustainability in your research, how you can link your research to the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the first question. Look at the 8 competencies, and I invite you to look at which of these competencies are most critical for you personally to develop, and also which of these competencies you can, in a very conscious way, link to your research. How can you link the outcomes of your research with the development of these 8 competencies? If you form part of an institution, how can you apply the whole institution approach to your context? So if you're an educational institution, it's not just about the curriculum, it's about the pedagogy, it's about the governance, it's about involving the administrators, the leadership. It's about procurement, it's about waste management, it's about student action, it's about the higher education institution and how it positions itself with the community. I invite you to reflect on what first steps can you take to advance sustainability within your future work. What first steps can you take to advance sustainability within your current project, within this cost action? I invite you to pause this webinar. The final part of this webinar, so since I am focusing, as I said, specifically right now on agroecology, is to focus a bit more on what we have learned up to now and look a bit at agroecology. However, this last part could be substituted by different challenges, different topics that interest us. Because I attempted to give you a good grounding in the development of sustainability thinking, in the acquisition of the necessary competencies that are needed. I am currently focusing a lot of my energy and research on the agroecological transition. So the last part is especially for those of you who are interested in the patterns of production and consumption of food. A lot of work has been done by the FAO, and in 2018, FAO have issued the 10 elements of agroecology. You can also pause this webinar and scan the QR code that you have at the bottom right of this slide. And if you are not very familiar with agroecology and its concepts, you can read about it. However, to do the work a bit easier for you, I am going to outline and explain a bit what is agroecology. So first of all, an agroecology fits perfectly in the acquisition of the systems thinking competency. It is a holistic approach. It is much more than a set of practices. It is a science. So of course, if you're studying agronomy, crop science, the science is so important, but it is also a movement, a political movement, if you want. It is not just theory, but it is a set of practices that integrate ecological and social principles for the sustainable production of food. It is looking at food as a system. That's why it fits so nicely in the systems thinking. It emphasizes the interactions between plants, animals, humans, and the environment within agriculture systems. And this links perfectly with this cost action because it seeks to address the same global challenges which we are trying to address through shift. The climate change challenge, the need to build resilience and mitigate against emissions, the biodiversity loss challenge, the need to protect and enhance natural ecosystems, the food insecurity challenge, the need to ensure equitable access to nutritious food, and the question of rural poverty, which is forcing many young people to actually leave rural areas. And I remind you that in the Global Action Program, we need to focus again on youth. So the idea that youth can stay within the locality that they were born because there are economic opportunities there. The idea of empowering farmers and strengthening the local economies. So the Food and Agriculture Organization has identified these 10 interconnected elements that guide its necessary transition to agroecological food systems. And these elements provide a comprehensive framework for action. So in this slide, I invite you to pause again and spend some time reading and understanding these 10 elements of agroecology. I will here only read the titles for you, but I invite you to pause this slide here and go a bit more in depth. So diversification, the idea of co-creation and sharing of knowledge, the idea of building synergies, and this again falls really nicely under the systems thinking competency, the idea of efficiency, the idea of recycling, because nature is actually cyclic in nature in its own. If we look at the forest, nothing is wasted, yeah, in nature. The idea of building resilience, which is becoming a very important discourse within the climate change challenge. The idea of human and social values. And here again, it links really nicely with the development of the concept of sustainable development, which invited us to focus beyond the GDP and much more on quality of life and social well-being. The idea of this solidarity economy and circular economy, so this responsibilization of corporations, but also this invitation to create social economy initiatives, social enterprises, where, of course, being an entrepreneur and doing your business well is important, but how it also gives something to the community and actually creates a plus, the idea of the triple bottom line, where beyond the plus, the profit that traditionally businesses are invited to make in a normal, in a mainstream economic initiative, through the triple bottom line, one also looks at the plus, the surplus that is left towards society and towards the environment. That this can only be done through responsible governance. And again, here I'm linking with some research that proposes governance as another pillar for sustainable development. And number 10, I think it's crucial, and we have already spoken about the importance of culture. And in food, it becomes particularly important, culture and food traditions. So, when I explained education for sustainable development, I emphasized the need to bridge the gap between knowledge and action. And here again, the successful adoption of agroecology requires much more than just technical knowledge. It requires a robust set of sustainability competencies. So the competencies that I have outlined in this presentation are crucial for driving the necessary systemic change. And I am moving towards the end of this webinar, where I took a few of these competencies and I am here doing some work for you and linking them in a more explicit way to this agroecological transition. So the self-awareness and critical thinking competencies, for example, are very much about recognizing one's own biases, assumptions, and impact, combined with the ability to analyze information and challenge conventional wisdom. These are really crucial for innovation and adaptation in agroecology. As many of us are aware, we have too much embarked on industrialized models of agriculture, and this is now being seriously challenged, partly through the climate change challenge that is inviting us to rethink agriculture in a different way. So this also requires understanding one's own biases, understanding one's own education system, the need to unlearn what we have learned, the need to challenge the way we have always done things. And this is so important for innovation and adaptation in agroecology. The strategic competency. So if we really need to shift towards agroecological practices, we need foresight, we need planning, we need the capability to develop and implement strategies. And in part of my research, even under this shift cost action, I am doing some work on what we call biodistricts or ecoregions. And ecoregions provide this opportunity for communities to come together and strategize together. These ecoregions and biodistricts are actually a geographically defined region that within this region, different stakeholders can come together to strategize regarding this shift towards the agroecological transition. This strategic competency helps in envisioning and executing these transitions. The normative, the value-based competency, which, as I explained, is also about the ethical reflection. So agroecology, by its very nature, is inherently value-driven. It emphasizes social justice, it emphasizes environmental stewardship. In fact, for example, within permaculture, that can form a very important part of this agroecological transition, we talk about zone 5, which is living part in the wild, as nature has always been. And this is partly an ethical reflection, it's partly a question of respect and care for nature, and it's also partly pragmatic, the protection of biodiversity. This normative competency enables critical reflection on the ethical implications of agricultural practices and policies. So it really invites us to look at the over-reliance, for example, on pesticides. It invites us to look at policies linked to heirloom seeds, to traditional seeds, and reflect on the ethical implications of such policies. The systems thinking competency, so especially for people who have studied agronomy and crop science, the understanding of the intricate web of relationships within agroecosystems, plants, soil, water, climate, social structures, this is really fundamental. And here I'm emphasizing also social structures. So we cannot look at science in a vacuum, but also the social structures. This systems thinking competency allows practitioners to identify leverage points for positive change. The collaborative competency, so I will leave my email at the end of this webinar, because as I have explained, I'm also doing some work linked to biodistricts, ecoregions, and also under this shift ecost, I am publishing a couple of material on this agroecological transition as linked to ecoregions, and this really involves the collaboration between diverse stakeholders, farmers, consumers, policymakers, and researchers. And if you contact me, I would be able to forward you the work that I am doing, because this collaborative competency, I think, is really crucial. It's vital for fostering partnerships, which is really part of the SDGs, sharing knowledge and building consensus. The meta competence of integrated problem solving, we all know when we actually go in the field and talk to farmers, and I have done a lot of work talking to farmers, even as part of a short-term scientific mission that I am doing under the Shift Cost Action. And the challenges that farmers face are real. The vulnerability is real. So the truth is that we have complex interconnected challenges. So this integrated problem solving competency, this ability to apply diverse problem solving frameworks is essential to design effective agroecological solutions. So to start concluding this webinar, we need leadership. Transformational leadership in agroecology goes beyond managing the existing systems as they are. It's actually an invite to move out of the dominant paradigm thinking, the dominant paradigm mindset, and to explore alternative paradigms that inspire and empower stakeholders to collectively envision and build fundamentally new sustainable food systems. This leadership bridges actually traditional disciplinary boundaries, agriculture, ecology, social sciences, and this is one of the beautiful things that the Shift E-Cost action is trying to do, to move beyond single disciplinary thinking and bridge the traditional disciplinary boundaries and also the societal divide. Sometimes we have divides between farmers and consumers, or between farmers and academics, or between rural areas and urban areas, and foster a shared vision. And through this normative competence that emphasizes values, the values of empathy, active listening, and the ability to facilitate dialogue and consensus among diverse groups. So leadership, even within the creation of important strategic agroecological transitions within ecoregions is so important. Creating these spaces for dialogue among and between different stakeholders. So, to conclude, transdisciplinarity is key to agroecological transformation. We need to move beyond multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinary approaches to truly transcend disciplinary boundaries. This involves co-creating knowledge and solutions with practitioners. Many years ago, I was lucky enough to visit some farmers in Nicaragua, and they were working closely with a university that considers itself to be a community university. And this university actually referred to the farmers as researchers, because the farmers are those that daily go about experimenting to find the right formula, the right recipe to give them the yield that they want. So we really need to involve practitioners, local communities, and diverse knowledge holders in this co-creating of knowledge and solutions. So, of course, we need to ensure that the innovations that science is producing remain at the center of our work, but also enrich this scientific understanding by practical experience and traditional wisdom. This approach fosters a deeper understanding of complex agroecological challenges and also the idea of context. It enables the development of more effective context specific and socially equitable solutions. So I would like to thank you for your attention as part of this webinar. My email is here, censu.caruana@um.edu.mt. If you're interested to get to know more about the work being done as part of the Shift Cost action in my own research on the agroecological transition and bioregions, please contact me on email and I will get back to you. So that's it for now. I would like to again thank the Shift for giving me this opportunity for this webinar, and I hope that you have found it useful for your research and for your work. Thank you.